All right. Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. I almost said Thursday. It kind of feels like Thursday today. Hopefully, you guys are having a great start to your Wednesday, regardless of when you're watching this video. If you're watching it in the afternoon, good afternoon. And if you're watching it in the evening, good evening. We're going to be doing another video on what is now Tropical Storm Lee as it continues to move west-northwest across the central Atlantic and ever so closely making its way into the Leeward Islands and the Aleutian Islands, so to speak. We're going to be giving you guys an update with the latest on its development as well as its track. And the one thing that I want to note right off the bat is this. There obviously is a lot of uncertainty about this system once it progresses past the Leeward Islands. We know for a fact, and I don't want to spoil too much of the video, but we do know that it is going to continue its west-northwest trajectory and eventually turning more of a northwesterly direction, maybe even more north once we get into late this weekend into early next week. Totally understand that. The philosophy that I have with tracking the tropics is that we still have to keep an eye on it. There have been times throughout history where these tracks, these cones of uncertainty, have changed dramatically one way or the other. So when we have a system like this going into the environment that it's going into, where we do expect it to rapidly develop into potentially a major hurricane by the weekend, this is certainly not something that we want to just turn a blind eye on. I know there's been a lot of folks talking about it being a fish storm. We even don't know that to be the case. It could still have implications on somewhere, potentially in the lower 48 and maybe even our Canadian provinces. I mean, there still is a lot of questions that remain. And we're going to go into how we come to those questions, why there's so much uncertainty once we get past the weekend. Here's what we know right off the bat. And again, I'm not trying to spoil everything in this video, but what we know is that we do anticipate Tropical Storm Lee to eventually become a hurricane, possibly as early as Wednesday night, and then eventually transition into a major hurricane once it taps into that really supportive environment downstream and eventually become a major hurricane by this weekend. So we're going to get into all of that here during this video. And if you do enjoy today's video, as I always say, be sure to like, subscribe, share with family and friends who certainly need to be aware of this developing system and keep a close eye on it. And with that being said, let's get into today's video. All right, so we're going to begin first with the big picture out here in the Atlantic. And guys, as a meteorology junkie, okay, this picture right here has so much going on, and I want to take a moment to dive into it and really extrapolate what's happening here. I know, obviously, to start, here is what is Tropical Storm Lee as it continues to move west-northwest. You do notice, and we'll get to this during the video, but you notice that, well, I should say this. Last night, it's not shown on the stream here, but this outer band really ramped up with its convection. We saw a lot of deep convection on the outer band of our tropical system. And what you're noticing that as of this morning, while we do have that banding taking place, it's really weakening quite a bit. We're going to get into why that is here in just a moment. But I just wanted to make note. Here is Tropical Storm Lee. It currently is sitting on the precipice of hurricane threshold. And as I said at the top of the video, I'm certainly expecting the system to become a hurricane of very low end category 1 by tonight. That would be my guess, and we're going to see if we're right once we make our video here tomorrow morning. But just upstream of that, you have a lot of convection coming off the African coast. And this has been something that we didn't really see in the beginning of hurricane season. We had a lot of Saharan dust that was coming off the coast. And, you know, these storms and any of this convection, we don't like dry air, right? If we're trying to get tropical development and upscale growth, we do not like Saharan dust because that can really perturb it, along with other factors like wind shear. In this case, we have a very favorable environment off the African coast. And, you know, of course, our main focus is going to be the development of Lee. But then once we get into potentially early next week, we're also going to have to keep in mind this tropical development for any sort of invest or depression evolution. So this is something that we'll also have to be keeping a close eye on too, simultaneously with the development of Tropical Storm Lee. But the other thing that maybe not a lot of folks might grasp, and I find this to be really cool, is if we look at our synoptic pattern, we talk about ridges and troughs, and our ridges are typically associated with drier conditions and areas of high pressure down towards the surface, and our troughs are morely associated with low pressure systems, these circumpolar lows that are displaced. So when I looked at these synoptic features, when we talk about ridges and troughs, that's usually what we associate with once we transcend down to the surface. Of course, there's more to that, but I don't want to complicate or melt anybody's brain here. But what's really cool is these synoptic scale features you can actually see on GO-16 satellite right now. Here is your ridge that's pretty elongated once it goes off the page into Greenland, and then you see this long wave troughing feature that's out towards the United Kingdom. And again, I'm geeking out over this as a meteorology major, but I gotta say, this feature, the fact that you can see this ever so predominantly on GO-16 satellite, along with your sort of these lower scale features like your tropical systems and your convection, is just really cool to see and very textbook. The other thing, of course, to note is out towards Bermuda, I should say well east of Bermuda, excuse me, you do have sort of this other low pressure system that's sort of meandering away. And sort of stationary. I believe that was a resemblance of a former tropical system that is now getting sheared out. But just something really cool to know, and I wanted to share with you guys. Here's another implementation of this, or not implementation, but interpretation is the right word. Interpretation of that map. And this is our upper level water vapor imagery. And so what you're going to see here in a moment is an up-close view of Tropical Storm Lee. And as we talked about just now, and I sort of foreshadowed, these outer bands of convection are weakening quite a bit. And there's a reason for that. We actually do have sort of this northerly flow, ever so weak, that's coming down into this system. And as you notice downstream of Tropical Storm Lee, you have this drier air out ahead of it. And so what's happening is, if you're wondering why, hey, Brendan, why does the system look weaker today, at least at the moment? It's because it's actually encountering some drier air. The water vapor imagery sort of shows that. And then if we were to overlay our wind barbs, so our direction of the winds, there actually is northerly winds feeding into it as well. And in these storms, it's encountering essentially this low-level shear. So a combination of some subtle dry air downstream, as well as your shear values, low-level shear, is really what's sort of perturbing the system from rapid development on sort of its outer banded convection. Now, the question is, does that affect its development going forward? I would say that it may slow it down, but as you notice, at least on the water vapor imagery, it is still fighting off that dry air and that weak shear and trying to recycle itself. So we certainly do expect it to still go into a favorable environment, and the models do show that this northerly component is expected to weak ever so substantially as we get later on this afternoon into this evening, which subsequently would then sort of weaken our water vapor here downstream and sort of condense it, as you can kind of see here on the map. The other thing to note is, keep in mind, this is our outer band starting to encounter that drier air, but notice that the center of our low is sort of encountering that, but it also is trying to recycle. So this is something that, tropical systems do have to go through sometimes. They have to go through a temporary stable environment, and they have to fight that off and recycle. But what you'll see in our model guidance is that is not going to perturb it from rapidly intensifying, because we still do expect that the environment downstream will eventually become much more favorable for the development of a hurricane. And the reason why is because, again, we are going to start to see these northerly winds weaken, as well as our water vapor imagery, as we see this dry air eventually continue to move off into the west. Keep in mind, too, we also have this easterly flow that's pretty potent in our upper levels that's helping to steer a lot of this convection as it continues to move to the west-northwest. So this is our current 500 millibar jet. Really drives the point home that I talked about here. Again, here's your easterly flows and moves off the coast of Africa. You do have this ever so weak northerly wind that's transcending down towards Tropical Storm Lee. And when I mean weak, guys, I'm talking anywhere probably between 5 to 10 knots of low-level shear. Although it is shear that can perturb tropical development, it is going to continue, and we do expect that to weaken as we go forward in time. And hey, guys, look at this. We checked out the GO-16 satellite at the top of the discussion, and we can actually match that up, right? Here's our ridge we talked about, and here's that large long wave trough as it goes through Spain and Western Europe. So Pretty cool, right? It's just a little factoid I wanted to share with you guys. Sometimes you can see these large-scale features on GOES 16 satellite, and it's just a wonderful thing to look at. So, on 500 millibar, also we can see, of course, Tropical Storm Lee as that continues its west-northwest trajectory. All right, let's now move on. I just erased that real quick. Let's move on to the zoomed-in picture, and this is our GOES 16 channel with the IR point of view as of this morning. And again, this really drives home the point. Look at our banding, right? A lot higher cloud tops initially, but those have subsided a bit. You are trying to get some redevelopment on the north, I would say the northwestern quadrant of the system. But notice that your low is still remaining rather intact. And as a matter of fact, this is sort of acting as a shield to perturb any dry air from getting into the center of circulation. It's going to be interesting to see if any of this breaks up. It really just depends on timing here. But again, we are expecting this to, of course, re-intensify to develop. We might see a little bit of some weakening here, maybe or maybe not, but it wouldn't be surprising to see a brief period of weakening as we're seeing here on our sort of outer bands of convection. But again, your low is staying rather intact. The center of circulation is still showing some pretty robust development, which is a good sign if you're looking for an intensifying system. Of course, if you're not, right, and you're looking for a weakening system, then you would really want to see that dry air really kind of penetrate the center of the low. But again, this outer band of convection is really taking a hit by that low-level shear and that dry air downstream, but it's not really allowing for it to interfere with the center of circulation, which is a sign that it's kind of acting as this barricade to prevent it from getting in and sort of destroying the development we're seeing in the intensification within the center. This is our 850 millibar heights, and this is taking a look now at the GFS model, and this is as of 6Z, so be sure to keep that in mind. By the way, the products that I'm pulling from is from College of DuPage, from Tropical Tidbits, and I believe that's it. Oh, and the Null School. So those three websites I highly recommend you check out. And of course, for the latest updates, be sure to seek guidance from the National Hurricane Center, as they will be providing continuous updates throughout the day. This is, of course, again, the 850 height. And as you notice, if we look at our low levels, here is this Bermuda high that's really not over Bermuda. It's well to the east of that. But as we've talked about throughout these streams, right, these areas of high pressure with a 1590 height field, this is going to provide clockwise flow. Remember, our high pressure spins clockwise in the northern hemisphere, and that does act as our steering mechanism for these tropical systems. So what you're going to see towards the end of the video is that our spaghetti plot takes this sort of hard northwest turn, right? And you could say the reason why that is because, well, we have this high expected to develop and eventually move to the northeast and then steer this in that clockwise direction. The question then becomes, right, because, I mean, here's the thing. The only way it takes that hook is if you have some sort of synoptic feature that punches it to the east. But that being said, we're going to talk about why there's a lot of variability with what's even going to happen in the lower 48 beyond this weekend. If we were just to draw the high pressure on its own and not even take into account anything that's happening in the lower 48, well, this, you could argue that the high is just going to steer it right into the Carolinas. The question, though, becomes, well, what happens synoptically? Because we're in a very progressive pattern here in the United States where we have this sort of ridge trough pattern to where any system that was to be steered towards, say, the Carolinas would arguably then be steered towards the Carolinas and then punted away out to sea. But what you're going to find is, again, there's still a lot of questions there as far as the lower 48 pattern is concerned. But what we have very high confidence in, at least in the immediate term, is that this system is going to go into a very favorable environment out here, and I would actually draw it more to scale. It's really going to be within this region of the the Western Atlantic, and then eventually it's going to hook sort of northwest. What happens beyond this point is certainly a huge question mark. If we were to go off the spaghetti plot right now, it's really showing it going more towards the north, but beyond that point, we really have no idea what happens. So, again, we're going to get into that here during the video, so don't let me forget, guys. We'll be sure to talk about that. Here is the Euro interpretation, and as you notice, very strong agreement between the Euro and GFS on this high pressure placement to where we do see this system sort of riding the high and then eventually turning to the west-northwest. It already is moving west-northwest, but I mean taking more of sort of this west and then northerly turn, so more of a I would say, northwest turn. Again, as we talked about, though, beyond this point, and this is really forecasted towards, I would say, the weekend, getting into early next week is this time step, we don't really know what's going to happen here in the lower 48. It's still too far out to predict that. What I would say is right now to sort of conclude, because I don't want to forget talking about this, so we're just going to talk about it right here. I would say that my guesstimate, at least as of right now, is that we are going to see a ridge build across the southwest once again, and that jet is going to punch eastward. Of course, the strength of this jet is in question, but this would actually perturb it from hitting the Carolinas and going more north. Once it gets up towards the far New England area of this region, that's when there's just way too much model uncertainty to talk about, you guys. So that's certainly in question. It may just continue to go out to sea, and it doesn't affect anybody. But, again, the reason why we got to keep tabs on this system is because even if we have the solution that I think is going to happen, which is going to be it sort of being punched out away from the Carolinas, is really what happens beyond that point. Are we going to see impacts towards Maine or towards Nova Scotia, New Brunswick? We don't know, because beyond, say, 150 hours, the models make a lot of assumptions on things that don't exist yet. So there's still a lot of questions that remain, but again, we are going to keep tracking this system as the days go on, whether it makes impacts on the United States or Canada or not. I think it's still very critical to keep an eye on this thing because changes still can happen. So certainly stay tuned to that. Let's go ahead and clear our screen and move on to the next part, which is the current cone of uncertainty. This is the latest advisory from the National Hurricane Center, and you can see, again, this is the cone of uncertainty, contains the probable path of the storm center, but does not show the size of the storm. And it says hazardous conditions can occur outside of the cone. Let's not forget, if we were to have a system that got close to the Carolinas or, say, near Bermuda, anywhere between this sort of middle point, parallel of these two areas, remember, we can also still have hazardous swim conditions. So there still presents hazards that we have to keep an eye on. So the National Hurricane Center is expecting this, at least as of the latest advisory, to go major status by the time we get into Friday and Saturday, and then is expected to become a hurricane by potentially late tonight into very early tomorrow morning. So by the time we make this video tomorrow, we will likely have a Category 1, what will now be, or then be, Hurricane Lee. Latest advisory also shows maximum sustained winds of 65 miles per hour, so very much on the precipice of hurricane status, with a west-northwest movement at 14 miles per hour. So it is moving quite fast. We have seen a slight slowdown. If you remember from yesterday, it was about 15 miles per hour in the movement. It slowed down by 1 mere mile per hour, but it is still moving rather quickly across the Atlantic as it continues within that trajectory. Now, here is the good old spaghetti plot, guys, and as you know, I mean, a lot of folks are going to run to this, right? Category 5. Here's the thing, as I remind you from yesterday's video, even within this spread, there's pretty high confidence it's going to be a high-end tropical storm Cat 1. We already have reached essentially the close to that benchmark or that threshold. Keep in mind, this is in knots. So I would say that, pretty high confidence within this spread that we will see a Cat 1 within the next 12 to 24 hours. But beyond this point, guys, 60 hours and between 108, this is your spread, folks. Anywhere between a Cat 1 and a Category 5. All right? So here's the deal. There is still quite a bit of spread and a ton of uncertainty as far as the strength of this system is concerned, even beyond, say, the next 60 to 84 hours out. So again, I know a lot of folks are going to run to this. Category 5, please hold your breath on that, okay? That would certainly be the worst case scenario. But my methodology for forecasting is I really like to try to find any sort of middle ground approach, and it is going to be, I would say, anywhere between, in the next 72 to 96 hours, a low-end Cat 2 to probably a Cat 3. I try to stay conservative within the spread. But keep in mind, this spread is still very broad. A lot of things still need to be resolved. The other thing that I do expect, and I mentioned this in yesterday's video, is that we will probably see a reconnaissance mission on this system probably before the weekend, depending on the strength of this. If it undergoes rapid intensification like we expect it to, we're probably going to have a recon mission go out there on behalf of NOAA and take some measurements, and I'm sure we'll have to keep tabs on that. And if there is a reconnaissance mission, we will surely dissect that, because I always love looking at those. They're very, very cool, and they're also very important for data collecting, because that important information of those cross sections will then be fed into these models where we can see a lot more correction of our spread and a little bit more consistency. So a lot of uncertainty here. If I was to go on the conservative end, would not be surprised to see a Cat 2 close to a major by the time we get to the weekend. If these storms do undergo rapid intensification like I expect it to, then certainly these models will have to be adjusted towards a more major severe event. So we'll have to certainly keep tabs on that. And here, last but not least, is our spaghetti plot. And as you can see, very good consistency as far as the Leeward Islands is concerned. Our spread is very confident that it is going to move to the northwest of the Leeward Islands. Still could see some impacts, again, with our swimming conditions, some very high rip currents there, and maybe some high tide. But beyond that point, look at our spaghetti plot, right? It is showing more of a northerly trajectory once it gets to 25 degrees north latitude and away from the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. Now, keep in mind, our spread is very broad at this point, so there's a lot of questions that remain. What is going to be our jet pattern in the lower 48 towards the weekend? Beyond the weekend, where does it go past that point? Are we still seeing a potential impact to very far portions of New England, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick? Still don't know that yet, to be quite honest with you, because again, these models are making a lot of assumptions beyond a certain time step. So we're going to continue to keep you guys updated. Again, I know that there's a lot of questions that remain, and there are different folks in the weather community that have different approaches to talking about this. Again, my philosophy is I still think it's important to talk about it because things can change, and we are talking about a major hurricane out in the Atlantic, so we certainly still have to keep tabs on it, and we will continue to keep you guys updated over the next few days and into next week. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and as I mentioned at the top of the video, be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Share it with family and friends, especially for our folks along the eastern seaboard, just so they can keep an eye on it. We're not asking them to panic. There's no reason to freak out right now. This is still very far out. We just want you guys to be informed and be aware of what's happening out in the Atlantic. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you tomorrow on our next video.